Welcome back to Jersey Matters. A startling new report on the effects of COVID-19 on communities of color in New Jersey. It's called Repairing the Cracks: How New Jersey Can Help to Restore Black and Brown Communities Ravaged by COVID-19 and Systemic Racism. The report was put together by the New Jersey Institute of Economic Justice. Here's my interview with its director, Laura Sullivan. Thank you so much for joining us. I know New Jersey and the Murphy administration has made a big deal about reaching out and trying to help protect communities of color in New Jersey during the pandemic and getting vaccinated. You recently put out a report, and in the name of the report, you talk about communities of color being ravaged by COVID-19 in New Jersey. What were your findings?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here to talk about this important report that we put out. Unfortunately, here in the state of New Jersey, we've been particularly hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. We've all experienced the pandemic together, but we're not all experiencing it in the same way. And communities of color here in New Jersey have been particularly hard hit in terms of both health impacts and economic impacts. We've had over 27,000 deaths here in the state of New Jersey, but Black people in New Jersey are twice as likely to be hospitalized. They're more likely to face health impacts and death. In the city of Newark, which is 50% Black and 30%, or excuse me, about a third Latino, we've seen over 850 deaths in the first year of the pandemic, while that's a greater number than over 5 states in the first year of the pandemic. So we've all been particularly hard hit, with New Jersey as the second highest rate of death in the nation since the start of the pandemic, being eclipsed only by Mississippi in recent weeks. But communities of color, because of the pre-existing cracks in our foundation, as highlighted in our report, the pandemic has disproportionately hurt communities of color across a number of areas of our lives.
What you're saying and what your report has found is 180 degrees from what we're hearing from the state on how they're dealing with communities of color. They speak glowingly of their outreach and the job they've done. And I want to read something that you, I read the Salon Magazine article that you were in, and you said at one point the death and discharge data from all New Jersey state municipalities, and this is your quote, is not accurate. Can you explain that?
So we have seen the state work to bring equity to our to their response to the pandemic. However, because of the pre-existing cracks in our foundation, communities of color have still faced disproportionate impacts due to the pandemic. So in terms of the data availability at the municipal level, we were part of a team that worked with legislative partners to help advocate for and pass legislation that required that municipal level data be produced by race and ethnicity on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We did find that recently that was not being updated, and several municipalities, the data did not appear to be accurate. The numbers were not in sync with what we know about what was happening in some of our cities. However, there have been updates in the last week or so, and we've seen that the state has made some updates to that data. So what we want to see moving forward is that data is updated regularly, and that the state makes sure that the accuracy is maintained.
And explain why it's important to have that data be accurate.
Well, we thought that legislation was really important, and that the data moving forward throughout the pandemic has been crucial, because we need to, as I noted, repair the cracks in our foundation. In fact, public health experts have said inequity is one of the greatest pre-existing conditions during this pandemic. And so we need to have tailored responses that address the needs of communities of color in our policies, and in our policies in particular that address what's going on during the pandemic.
I know there's social, economic, and medical reasons for the COVID-19 hitting the communities of color so hard. I do want to talk about vaccinations, though, because it seems like national data and local data, like in Philadelphia, they just did a report that African American communities, especially, seem to be the most vaccine resistant, and that must lead to a problem in those communities. I know the state has been reaching out to try to get communities of color vaccinated. Are you seeing that, and what are the reasons for that?
Well, our research has identified that communities of color are equally interested in getting the vaccine, but face barriers to getting those vaccines. And so whether it's barriers to adequate transportation, barriers for folks who are homebound, folks who can't take time off work, those are folks who are having more difficulty accessing vaccines and are more likely to be people of color. So we think that the efforts that the state has done to address equity in vaccines are important, and that needs to continue moving forward. In our report, we highlight that as one of the important things we must do in the short term to make sure that we all get through this pandemic.
Well, that's fascinating, but there's some kind of disconnect, right? I mean, if that is the only problem, if there's a great interest in getting the vaccine, and there's still people in those communities are still unvaccinated, there's a disconnect. And you said you highlighted it in your report. Did you come up with a remedy? Because we keep hearing there's great outreach, and yet the numbers are still bad.
Well, I think, we're seeing increasing opportunities for folks to get vaccinated, and that outreach needs to continue. I think, in addition, we've highlighted a number of other things that we can do to get us through this pandemic together. So we need to make sure that the great amount of funds that have been available for rental assistance are available and known by folks who need them. So there's a number of different things we need to do. I think continued efforts on vaccine equity are important, but we also need to address all of the different issue areas that our report highlights that lead communities of color to be disproportionately vulnerable.
Right. I just was focusing on the vaccine because there is some data on that, and also it's a big topic in the news right now. But please tell me the number one way you believe we can improve those numbers in communities of color.
Well, I think our report highlights, as I noted, some of the short-term things that we need to do, but we also need to address the long-term reality that we have a history of policies that have led us to some of the greatest disparities in the nation in terms of disparities by race and ethnicity. We have the 6th most segregated schools in the state. We have among the worst disparities in terms of newborn mortality between Black and white people in the state. So we need to actually repair our foundation in the state to ensure that we have equity moving forward. So some of the policy proposals that we are looking at include the New Jersey Reparations Task Force, which will look at the history of systemic racism in our state, starting with slavery, and prepare proposals that can repair our state's foundation. In addition to that, we're looking at housing investments to reduce some of the homeownership disparities in our state. We actually have one of the highest racial wealth gaps in the nation, and so we need to have intentional investments to repair that disparity that we see in our state. We're also looking at investments in youth and investments in our voting systems and ensuring that everyone has access to voting through same-day registration. So we have a number of policy proposals that impact all areas of our lives that we really think are important for ensuring that communities of color are not more disproportionately impacted in the future.
It's impressive, and I'm glad you did it. I guess the problem I have, and I should point out, when you say we, you keep talking about the state of New Jersey, and I guess the problem I have is this has been a big priority of this administration since they came into office. And has it improved over the last 4 years? Before I disparage them, I want to make sure I'm saying the right thing, because you're talking about how bad it is, and yet they've been working on this, they say, for the last 4 years.
I think that there have been important improvements in the state, but we have much more work to do. We have a long history of systemic racism in this country, and so it's going to take all of us coming together to advocate for and promote policies that reduce the disparities that we see today. So I acknowledge that the efforts, but we all need to do more.
But
And
you also find in your report that we are lagging far behind the rest of the nation.
In a number of racial disparities, we are have some of the worst racial disparities in the nation. As I highlighted previously, our racial wealth gap is among the highest in the nation. Some of the other disparities are among the worst in the nation. So we have a lot of work to do. We think of ourselves as a progressive state, but there's much more we can do to make sure that we are more equitable moving forward.
Yeah. Now, what is next with the? So it's several pieces of legislation, right? It's not just one. It's not one comprehensive. It's several pieces of legislation. What is the progress with that right now?
Well, so we are actively advocating for the New Jersey Reparations Task Force and hope that it will be passed this year. Some of the other initiatives have been introduced. Some still need to be developed into legislation. So we're advocating this fall to ensure that the New Jersey Reparations Task Force is passed and becomes law.
Wonderful. Well, do me a favor, please keep in contact with us. Let us know, and we'll keep having you on so we can do all we can do. Because I believe it is stunning to hear the results of your report. It is stunning because we've heard so much about how well New Jersey is doing, and your report is showing that something else is going on completely. I really appreciate your time. Thank you. Laura Sullivan, Director of the Institute for Economic Justice. Next on Jersey Matters.
2 local animal rescue groups returned to the Garden State after bringing much-needed supplies to residents and pets living in areas affected by Hurricane Ida. I'm Sherry Carabin, and coming up on Jersey Matters, I'll have that story.